So once the third layer is allowed to set up, which is usually going to be a few hours, then we can begin to consider where we want to separate this silicone piece into two pieces. Right now we essentially just have a silicone sock covering our portrait, and it won't come off our sculpture very easily, or a casting very easily without breaking it completely. In order for it to come off, we are going to have to make a separating wall that we will eventually cut through, making our silicone sock into two silicone pieces. I would suggest always, unless there's a very specific instance where this is not needed, but that's going to be very rare, I would almost always suggest having two silicone pieces per piece you intend to cast. So since this portrait is going to be cast as one piece, there's no arms or legs being taken off and then applied later, it's just going to be one cast as one piece. We will need two silicone pieces for this one portrait. While deciding where to place the wall, we also have to think about how to support the silicone, and so I do consider at this stage the model mold, though it might not be so apparent that I'm doing so. The model mold will be made in a separate video, a later video, but I'm already considering how, and we'll talk about that as well since it's part of my consideration at the moment. Do keep in mind that in order to understand everything that goes on here fully, you will probably need to watch the entire series once it comes out so you can understand how it all comes together at the end. Mold making is sort of working backwards and upside down, and so it can be rather difficult to understand unless you've seen the entire thing come together. It would be a decent choice in terms of making it easy to take the silicone and the model mold off, to split our mold along the center line of the head, straight down the middle of the face. Why would this make it easy to remove the mold? Well, it's because both sides are going to be the same, and we could make two model mold pieces over our two silicone pieces rather easily if we did it this way. However, the downside of doing it this way is that we would have a seam line running through the middle of the face. This means that once we get it cast out, we will have to retouch the seam line and it would run through an area of detail, which would be annoying and very difficult to deal with. And also, if we have any issues closing the mold, the issue would show up right in the middle of the face. If we couldn't close the mold perfectly around the nose, all of a sudden our nose is much wider than we intended to. And this means that we won't be able to hide any crimes. Therefore, I will usually choose to make the separating wall on a portrait from ear to ear or front to back. Doing it this way makes it a little more difficult to demold and a little bit more complex right now in regards to the model mold and the silicone, but it will make casting easier, and ultimately that's what I'm working towards here, making a mold that's going to be easy to cast in. First, I'll decide where I want the silicone wall to be, where the piece of silicone is going to be cut into two pieces of silicone. I like to use clay pieces to do this since it does help me see where the wall protrudes from the silicone skin, as opposed to marker pen, which number one, I can't really move around so easily, and also it won't stick up out of the surface so I can't see it when I step back. Clay pieces are much better because of this reason. With the clay pieces, I can see if I have any undercuts. If any of the clay pieces ever disappear behind the horizon when I step back, I have an undercut. I have to step back in the direction I intend the hard model mold shell to come off in order to read if I have any undercuts properly. I can't step off to the side or I can't be too close. I have to be pretty far away to see this properly. Some undercuts in the silicone are going to be okay because the silicone can flex around my casting within a certain amount. It can't flex forever, so I do have to be conscious of it and think about this and try not to rely too much on the flexible characteristics of the silicone when designing where my wall needs to be. And I also have to remember that the model mold is not going to be able to flex, and so undercuts are going to be issues once I try to make the model mold. This portrait being of somebody without hair does cause some issues in regards to the ears. I need to make sure I don't run my seam line through the ears, as this means running into the same issue as if I made the seam line directly across the face. It's going to be difficult to fix a seam line running through the ear. This time I chose to run the seam line in front of the ears, but what this means is that I will have undercuts from the back, as the piece of model mold for the back and the piece of silicone will have to wrap around the ears to the front of the ears. Now this is fine for the silicone, but for the model mold, this would lock on and wouldn't stick. It would stick, it wouldn't come off, the silicone. Now there's a pretty simple solution for this, and I'll solve this issue by simply making 2 model mold pieces for the back half of the head. I'll mark this with clay pieces as well. So when I look for if this solution is going to work after I place my clay pieces, I have to step back at an angle, sort of 45 degrees to where I previously stepped back, in order to tell whether or not the model mold piece will come off in that direction, or if it's still going to be stuck somewhere. So I can't step directly in line with the silicone piece as I did before. Now, this problem occurred on the back of the head, and it sort of occurred on the front of the head as well, probably because I had some undercuts under the chin or something like that. And since I'm in no rush here, and I always want to make a good and easy mold rather than a quick one, I decided to make 2 model mold pieces for the front half of the face as well. So what I'll end up with is 2 silicone pieces and 4 model mold pieces for my 1 cast piece. This is rather normal and not something that you should be very concerned about. This is not a very difficult mold at all, and these sorts of solutions that I'm coming up with here are not some sort of crazy thing. These are pretty common solutions to the issues you face when making a mold of a portrait. The model mold pieces will be made in next episode so that they can be bolted together, and once bolted together they will function as one and support the silicone piece easily. Now the front and the back half won't be made so that they can bolt together, they'll simply be pushed against each other and held in place with tape or bungee cord, but you'll see that later. There certainly are choices I could have made here that would have allowed me to make less model mold pieces. Perhaps just 1 for the front and 1 for the back. But that would have forced me to compromise somewhere else, like running my seam line through the ears, and I didn't want to do that. I've done that before, and I know what can happen when you do so I don't like that solution at all. Doing it this way means that there's more work for me to do now, but it will be easier for me in the future when I try to cast this piece, and ultimately I'm going to prefer that, since I'm more likely to cast this piece multiple times, and I'm only making the mold once. Once I've made my decision, I mark the wall placement with a permanent marker and remove the clay pieces, because if I'm applying silicone to make a wall, I can't apply it over the clay. Because I want to mark both where I want the silicone wall and where I want to separate the model mold, which we'll do later, I'll use 2 different kinds of markings to indicate what I intend to do along the marked line. You'd be surprised how many times I've seen students lose track and make mistakes, make silicone walls in places they didn't need to because of poorly managed organization. So stay organized, people, it really does help you out. Making the silicone wall is a multi-step process, and we'll cover it all here. We require a new material first and foremost. We will be using the same silicone as before, but now it's going to be pink, and that's because we're using a different catalyzer, but one from the same manufacturer, which you always should do. The pink catalyzer that I'm using sets up faster, and this is going to be a benefit for us as we do this. If we use the same yellow catalyzer that we used before, we are likely going to end up having to do some boring downtime, while we either wait for the silicone to set up, or fight the silicone to make sure it doesn't sag and deform while setting up. Neither of those is a lot of fun, and one of those, the latter one that is, has the potential to be a major disaster. So we'll use pink catalyzer, which will set up faster and which smells of raspberries. Both of which are desired qualities at this moment. The mixing of the silicone is the same, and it is vital to make sure the silicone is mixed really well. No streaks, as streaks here can mean we have to wait a really long time for the silicone to set up, or sometimes it means the silicone won't set up at all. I work using the color of the mixed silicone as a reference, and what I'll usually do is I'll mix a small batch, try it out, and leave a little piece on the table as a reference for future mixing. I'll make a mental note of the time it took for the silicone to set, how much silicone I used, and if it felt within reason to use this much silicone within the working time allotted by the mixing to this color. And then I'll adjust accordingly. If the silicone sets up too fast, I'll mix a little bit less silicone, or I'll mix it to a slightly lighter color to slow the setting down. Depending on the age of the gray silicone in the bucket and how much oil it has, the catalyzer seems to act differently. It's a little more temperamental, let's say, than the yellow catalyzer, so doing a small test like this as you start is a good idea. Of course, different manufacturers or different brands of silicone might have other quirks that you will have to get used to and learn. Most materials tend to be like this in my experience, and it's rare to find a material that does everything you need to perfectly all the time.